There once was a miller who had fell upon hard times. He became so impoverished that he could not support his wife or his only daughter. He only had, in his name, two possessions. One was an old mill that was generated and powered by a small stream nearby. And behind the mill was a beautiful, precious apple tree for which he adored and was grateful for. His daughter's favorite thing to do was to sit under the apple trees and smell the five-petaled flowers in the springtime. And in the fall, she enjoyed cutting the apples slices crossways so that she could see where the seed pods had formed beautiful five-pointed stars before she would eat them. One day, the miller had gone out to fell trees to split wood for the fire. And while he was whacking away at the trees with his axe, an old man to whom he had never met before approached him, and he said, "Why, sir, do you bother to cut these trees down?" The miller said, "I have to support my family somehow." "What if I," the old man said, "were to tell you you would never have to work another day of your life?" The old man chuckled and said, "Yes, that would be wonderful. Unfortunately, my life was not so lucky." "Your luck is about to change," the old man said. "I will make a deal with you. I will give you a life of leisure and untold riches of gold if you'll give me the one thing I want that's hidden behind your mill." The old miller thought for a moment. "Well, the only thing behind my mill," he thought, "is that precious apple tree, but compared to a life of leisure and riches, well, that's hardly anything." So the old miller shook the old man's hand and said, "You have a deal, you have my word." The old man then gave him a malevolent smile and said, "Tonight when you go home, you will find treasure chests of gold to your heart's desire. And in 3 years from now, I will return to claim what is mine." Then the old man disappeared in the shadows of the forest. The miller thought, "What an unusual old man. He's probably just a little bit crazy." And at first didn't make anything of it. But the curiosity got the best of him. He thought, "I wonder if that old man's words had anything to it." He stopped chopping with his axe, collected what wood he had, and headed on home. And when he got home, he was shocked. His living room was packed with treasure chests of gold, just as the old man had said. And his wife was delighted. "My dear husband, where did we get all this gold?" "I'll tell you. This morning when I was out chopping wood, an old man came up to me and said he would give me all these treasures of gold if he could have what was behind my mill. Suddenly his wife's countenance changed. "What?" she said. You said you would give him what was behind our mill? Why would you do a thing like that?" "What are you so fumigated about?" he said. "The only thing behind our mill is the apple tree, and as beautiful it is as it is. Why, with this gold, I can buy you as many apple trees as you want." Then the wife said, "That's not what I'm worried about. Clearly that old man you dealt with today was some kind of old wizard, and he's not interested in your precious apple tree. Do you not know that your daughter was out behind the mill this morning? He's after your daughter." Well, the miller became very perplexed, but he did not know what to do. He stewed over this for the 3-year period, while waiting for the wizard to come. His daughter was very beautiful, and many young men wanted to marry her. She was also very kind, hearted, and obedient. She followed everything her parents told her to do. She was a girl that was spotless, without sin. And at the completion of the 3-year period, the day before the appointed, right before the appointed day when the wizard would return, she dressed herself in white, bathed herself so that she was completely clean, and then with some white chalk she drew an unbroken circle all the way around her. And when the old wizard came to possess her and claim his debt, he could not touch her, because there was an invisible shield all the way around her. He could not find an opening through the circle to grab her. The old wizard said to the miller, "I cannot take her because she's too clean. You must deny her any water, and I will be back for her." The miller agreed, and he would not allow his daughter to bathe anymore. When she was good and smelly and dirty, her hands were grimy. His daughter began to well up with sorrow, and the tears flowed from her eyes like fountains of water. They poured over her grimy, dirty hands until they were clean and pure once again. When the old wizard came back to take her, he said to the miller, I still cannot take her, for she has clean hands. You will have to cut off her hands." The miller was horrified and said, "No, that was not part of our bargain. I will not cut my own daughter's hands off. You will, unless you want to come with me yourself." The miller was afraid of the old wizard, and he feared for his life. So when the wizard left, he told his dear daughter what the cold choice he had. I must cut your hands off, or risk my own life. And his obedient and pious daughter put her hands up on the table. Miller took his axe and chopped them off, right at the wrists. Of course, the pain was excruciating. And his daughter began to weep, so that the tears flowed like rivers, poured out over her nubby arms, until they were clean and pure. They were spotless, and her nubs were white without blood. When the wizard came back, he said, I still cannot take her. She is still clean. Nevertheless, I've rendered her useless anyway. Hell, you can have her. I have done what I set out to accomplish anyway. Then the wizard left, never to be seen or heard of again. The miller was very apologetic, pleaded for his daughter's forgiveness. He knew that no man would marry her with no hands, a woman who could not even do the simplest of chores. So he told her not to worry, that he would take care of her, tend to her needs for this one act of courage that she had shown him for the rest of his living days. But the daughter said, Father, I will not accept the pity. And I know that although no man in this village will accept me, I will go out into the world, and I will search until I find someone who has some sympathy on my behalf. And she left into the wilderness. But it soon became very apparent that a girl with no hands, trying to rummage for food with her mouth like a beak, would not survive long unless she had some kind of help. Near the end of that very first day, she was cold and hungry. But she came to a royal garden, and in the garden was a wonderful large tree laden heavy with pears. Oh, she thought, if I could just take a bite out of one of those sweet, delicious pears, I would be overjoyed and happy. Unfortunately, there was a large, deep moat that separated her from the tree. There was no bridge crossed. She could only sit and dream about having one of those pears. It became late, and she curled up under a bush and tried to sleep. But she was so hungry she could not. She turned and tossed in the darkness and became afraid. Finally, at 12 o'clock midnight, she invoked a prayer to her God. An angel of the Lord appeared before her, took her by the hand, and then proceeded to part the deep, watery moat, and walked her across on dry ground to the pear tree. The girl stretched her neck out, took hold of one of those pears with her mouth, and ate it. The gardener, who was watching over the garden, saw the whole thing. But he was afraid to approach the girl, as he thought she was a ghostly spirit. He froze, just stayed still, until the girl and the angel went back across the moat for the night. Early the next morning, the king came to the garden to inspect the gardener's work. When he got to the pear tree, he noticed that one of the pears were missing. He looked down on the ground to see if it had fell. But there was no pears on the ground. He inquired of the gardener, "I notice there's a pear missing. Do you know what has happened to it?" The gardener knew, of course, what happened to the pear. He did not want to tell the king because, well, he would kind of look a little foolish. On the other hand, if he didn't tell the truth, he could be accused of stealing the pear himself, which could incur a severe punishment. So he decided to tell the truth. And he told the king everything. "I was standing here," he said, "at midnight. Some kind of ghostly figure came into the garden who had no hands. She reached up with her mouth. She took one of the pears off the tree and ate it." The king said, "That's a good story. But how did she get across that moat? And where is she now?" "Oh," the gardener said, "well, an angelic figure came with her. The angel parted the moat and they walked across on dry ground. And now they left over the moat the same way." Well, that story is getting much better. You do get credit for a very good story. We will see if your story is true. Myself and my priest will stay with you tonight to see if she comes again. So that night they stayed in the garden with the gardener. The priest stayed with them to communicate with any spirits that came. Soon, at midnight again, the girl came with the angel, just as before. She reached her neck up, took one of the pears and ate it. The priest stood forward with the prodding of the king, and he questioned the girl. Are you a spirit from heaven, or are you mortal?" And the girl had said, "Why, I'm just a mortal girl. I don't even have hands." She told all of them about her unfortunate life and circumstances that she had to endure. When she was done telling her story, the king had great sympathy for her, and he invited her into his palace where his servants could care for her needs. She accepted, and she was tended to in the palace and provided food and shelter. The king visited her often. The more they visited one another, he came to know her heart. He came to know how wise she was, and although she had no hands, he came to look over that and fell in love with her. He had a silversmith make a pair of artificial silver hands for her to wear. And then he held a great marriage feast, and the two were married. She became known as the king with silver hands, and all the kingdom rejoiced in their marriage. And over the next year, things were wonderful. And although her hands were merely ornamental, not really having any functional quality to them, the king's servants and her husband became her hands for her. They loved her and served her. All came all this happiness came to an end, however, after she became pregnant. This was a year after they had been married. And unfortunately, there were great wars and rumors of wars that had spread over all of the kingdoms in the world. And her beloved husband, who was the king, was called into battle. At the very time that she needed his help. Of course, the king made every arrangement to help her through her pregnancy. He called his servants, and he even had his own mother stand by her side, taking care of her through her pregnancy. But it was not the same as having her beloved husband by her side. And so, over the next 9 months, being cared for by her mother-in-law, finally gave birth to her first child. And he was a healthy young boy. He was robust and strong, and the whole household was overwhelmed with joy. The queen had her stepmother pen a letter to her husband, telling her how much joy there was in the household over his firstborn son. The letter was sent via messenger, and along the way he stopped along near a brook to have his lunch and take a rest. It was at this point that the old wizard, who had the queen's hands amputated by her own father, appeared once again. Even though all the people were happy with the queen, he was feeling a bit spiteful. And felt cheated out. He was very surprised to find that she had become so happy, found a husband, not only a husband, but a king. and she was being taken care of. And now, why, she was going to have her grow her posterity. Could not have that. So he penned his own letter to the king. And while the messenger slept, he very quietly opened his leather pouch, pulled out the queen's letter, and exchanged it for the one that he had wrote. And when the king received the messenger's letter, instead of receiving the rejoicing news for his firstborn son, he had read the words of the old wizard, saying that the queen had gone mad, and her son that was born was a deformed monster. Of course, the king was devastated and sorrowful. At once he wrote another letter, expressing his reassurances for his love for his wife and for the deformed child. He said he would take care of them till the day he died. Unfortunately, the queen never received that letter, because when the messenger stopped on the way back at that brook, the old awful wizard again exchanged notes. And when his queen and the king's mother-in-law received the letter, instead of receiving his condolences and love, it was an order to kill the queen and her child. Well, the two of them could hardly believe that that's what he meant. It was not in his character to act like that. So she wrote another letter back to the king. But again, the old wizard intercepted and exchanged the letters, and this went back and forth, always receiving bad news from the old wizard. Finally, the queen and her stepmother received her mother-in-law received the final letter, and it not only ordered for her to kill his wife and his son, but she was also to remove his wife's eyes and to cut out his son's tongue as evidence that she had followed his orders. Well, the king's mother was horrified. She said, "My son, over these years of war, must have gone mad. I cannot follow this order. I will not kill innocent lives." So she went to the queen, and she said, "You must flee into the wilderness, never to return again. I cannot follow the king's orders." But the queen said, "What will become of you if you do not follow the king's orders? Your own life is in jeopardy." "Never mind that," she said. "I will think of something." And she strapped the child onto the Queen with Silver Hand's back, gave her some provisions, and sent her into the wilderness by the cover of dark. Well, soon after, the queen had fled. The king returned victorious in battle. And at once he came to his bedchambers to see his wife and his deformed child. And the mother was sickened. She said, "What a despicable, wicked man you are. How awful you are to come in here and have the gall to ask for your son and your wife after you have sent me these horrible letters to kill her. Is this what you want? Evidence that I have done the awful deed? Well, here it is." She handed him a jar that had 2 eyeballs and a tongue in it. "They're dead. There's their tongue and their eyes to prove it." "What?" the king said. "You did what? You killed them. I never gave such an order. No." "Oh, yeah," she said. "Here's the letter you sent me." And with tears in her eyes, she handed it to him. Well, the king was overwhelmed with grief, and he cried and mourned for days and days without eating or drinking. Finally, his mother could see he was sincere, and she went to tell him the truth. "My dear son, those eyes and the tongue that I showed you in the jar, why, they are not your wife. They are not from your wife or your son. I did not have the heart to kill them, could not follow your orders. Those are from a dead deer." And the king stood up. He embraced her. "Thank the Lord. They're still alive. Where are they?" "She fled into the wilderness. She will never return again. She is afraid that you no longer love her and desire her dead. I will flee into the wilderness to find her. I will not eat or drink or sleep until I do, even if I must die myself." He jumped on his horse, and away he went. The queen with silver hands and her son that was strapped on her back. Very soon after they left, it became apparent that she could barely take care of herself, let alone a child. She became lost in the wilderness, in the deep and dark forest. Her child began to cry. She could not console him. She could not provide food. She became afraid until she again invoked a prayer to her God. And when she opened her eyes from her prayer, before her was a small cottage with a light that burned in the window. And above the doorway was a little sign that read, "All who dwell here dwell in peace and freedom." Out from the front door emerged a beautiful maiden who was dressed in a radiant white dress. And her kind face said, "Dear Queen, please come in." She took her by the hand, led her into the cottage, She unstrapped the child that was crying on her back, and she sang it a lullaby and nursed it to sleep. And when all was quiet and peaceful, the queen said, "How do you know who I am? How do you know that I am a queen?" "Dear lady," she said, "I am your guardian angel. I have been sent here to comfort you and your child." And indeed, for the next 7 years, the queen with silver hands and her child stayed with this maiden. The child was taught to work, with his hands. He was taught to pray to his Father who was in heaven. And he became very wise, even in his young age. And while her son was developing and learning, his mother, nubby hands began to grow little fingers until her natural hands were restored in whole. She took the old silver hands that were artificial and merely ornamental and put them away in a drawer. And she began to also become independent. And her hands had the real power to serve. Just like the lamp that now had oil in it. After 7 years, her husband, the king, who had been searching for her over mountains and valleys, through deserts, never eating, never drinking or sleeping, but living off the support of heaven, finally, at midnight, had found the little cottage with a sign over it that said, "All who dwell here dwell in peace and freedom." The maiden came out, and she said, "Dear king, welcome, but why are you here?" And the king said, "I have been searching for my dear wife for the last 7 years. Can you help me find her?" The maiden said, "First, please come in and have something to eat and drink, and rest." The king did what she asked, and when he was sleeping on the bed, she drew the sheets up over his face, and then brought the queen and her boy into the room. The king had adjusted turned in bed, and the sheet had come off his face, and the queen could see it was her husband. She was frightened. She remembered the awful letters that he had wrote, and wondered if he still sought to kill her, and whether he no longer loved her. She told her son to put the sheet back up over his face. He did so, but because The king had recognized their voices in his slumber. He pulled the sheets back off his face, and his mother told her son, "Put the sheet back over your father's face." And her boy said, "How can I do that, mother? This is not my father. You said that I only have one father, and he is in heaven." Well, while they were talking, the king sat up, and he said, "Who are you?" And the queen, very courageously, said, "I am your wife. This is your son." And the king responded, "Well, you do have similar appearance and have a very similar voice, but you cannot be my wife. For my wife, she had artificial silver hands." And at that moment, the maiden with the white dress came out, and she had the old silver hands in her hands. She handed them to the king, and he looked them over, and then he knew. And she said, "Your wife's hands have healed." Then he knew that she was indeed his wife, and this was his son. He jumped up, and they embraced one another, and he was happy. The maiden fed them a feast before she waved goodbye to them as they returned to the kingdom. When they had returned back to his palace, all the people rejoiced greatly. And there was a second great and wonderful marriage feast, and great dancing and pomp to celebrate his return. In their latter years, with the queen's hands complete and whole, their joy was so full, their happiness complete, that they no longer remembered all the suffering that they had to endure from that old, awful wizard. The end. The Girl Without Hands. A Grimm's fairy tale retold by Stephen M. Cole.